Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another NBA season preview / off-season breakdown where we dive in and explore what a specific team did in this off-season and entail where I think they will finish gearing up into this season coming up. If you're new to this series, missed your team or feel like your team has been discussed in the past, definitely check out the previous videos. But if not, if you do enjoy the series, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you can stay tuned for when your team gets discussed, as we're going to be diving and exploring every single team before season start. Some days we'll have multiple uploads, so that is going to be the case. I really do appreciate all the love and support here on these videos. So without further ado, let's dive in and let's explore the Miami Heat. And the Heat are a very confusing team this off-season. They did go out, make some trades, make some moves, even make some potential signings that we'll get into when we look at their overall breakdown, looking at their rubric. But with the Eastern Conference getting a little bit weaker with teams like the Pacers and the Celtics, two teams that just made the past finals representing the Eastern Conference, losing their star players in Tatum and Halliburton due to Achilles injuries, it is said that the Eastern Conference is up for grabs, with some teams being in the mix, and with the Heat being one of those teams kind of on the outside these last couple of years. Some people think they could do better than predicted, but ultimately, I don't know if the Miami Heat are really going to thrive this year, even in a weakened Eastern Conference, from looking at their roster. When going into the depth, it is very tough for them in some instances, and we're going to have to break down and analyze that in this episode today. Like I mentioned, we'll be going over their additions, who they lost, and then ultimately going over my depth chart and their predictions. And as you know, we start off with those additions. So let's dive in and let's look at who the Heat added this off season. So the Heat went out and did some moves this season, and in majority of their additions, they went out and had some subtractions. So we'll get into those subtractions when they do come up. But as you can see, one of the main players that the Heat added this offseason was Simone Fontecchio, coming over from the Detroit Pistons, someone who replaced Bojan Bogdanovic as that kind of wing scorer for them for their rotational unit after they moved off from him, getting him from the Jazz. And he seemingly had a pretty solid role as a rotational scorer at that wing position, someone that can stretch the floor and be pretty viable. And I think for the Heat, he's going to be someone that can kind of come into that rotation, who had some struggles last year with some of their young guys, Nikola Jovic and Jaime Jaquez Jr., to really take over and implement himself as a key rotational piece. They also went out and got Norman Powell in another deal, and a 3-team deal revolving around the Los Angeles Clippers and the Utah Jazz again. And Norman Powell is going to come in and kind of be this scorer for them off the bench, or maybe even in this starting unit to start off the year, all depending on injuries. We'll have to see where Norman Powell does fit into this rotation, but had a great year last year with the Clippers. The start half, then got injured, seemingly fell out of the rotation in the second half once they started to get a little bit better. And with the Clippers wanting to kind of structure their team on either expiring contracts or in 2 years, Powell with his extension didn't really make sense for their building, so they moved off of him and gave him to Miami to add some additional scoring from their three-point level that they already lost this year. With both of those trades, they do, I think, get some pluses for what they had to give up, which we'll get into in a little bit later. I do think they didn't have to give too much to get these guys, ultimately had to give up some picks as well to get Norman Powell, but I think for the Heat, for where they want to strive in the Eastern Conference, this makes sense for them. And then they ultimately went out and made one signing, and it is labeled as an Exhibit 9 signing, and I do have that question mark in the depth chart, which we'll get to when we get there. But they signed Precious Achiuwa, who obviously was originally a Miami Heat player, was drafted in the lottery at pick 13 from the Heat just a couple seasons ago. Tried to fit in with this rotation, but seemingly struggled behind a guy in Bam Adebayo and was ultimately let go by the Heat and signed with the New York Knicks. He went to try to fit into that New York Knicks front court, didn't ultimately find his spot there, but now has signed with the Miami Heat and is on the Exhibit 9 deal. The main criteria with the Exhibit 9 deal comparative to an Exhibit 10 is if he is waived off that Exhibit 9 deal, he will not be able to join the G League team for the Miami Heat. With it being the Exhibit 9, it is more of him going to training camp and trying to compete for that final roster spot. The Heat do have one of those spots open, and with seemingly a big hole in their front court, Achiuwa would make sense for them to sign. Now, they may not ultimately go with him because some other players may get waived. There may be a trade happening, as we saw last year. Obviously, the Knicks and the Timberwolves made a really, really late offseason trade, and that could change some things. But at the moment, it does look like Achiuwa will be filling in that role into this front court here for the Heat. And then who they selected in the draft, someone that ultimately fell and was regarded as one of the better players in the draft process earlier on before the combine, and that is Kaspars Jakučionis. He is obviously the guard from Illinois, the playmaker, someone who can really set up an offense and really control it, something that the Miami Heat desperately need with their guard rotation in the past, obviously being a lot of just offensive pieces and just scorers, not really having that someone to really coincidentally set up that offense to maybe get those plays into check or to run that offense is something that they've lacked, and Jakučionis can do that. He's also a pretty decent three-point shooter, something that the Heat desperately did lose on their perimeter, so adding him as well into that guard rotation could definitely help them out. And then their two-way players are Myron Gardner and Vladislav Golden. They do have one open roster spot for a two-way spot, and they have multiple guys that are signed to Exhibit 10s. And as we know with the Miami Heat in the past, with guys like Gabe Vincent, Max Strus, guys that have panned out from two-way clubs or Exhibit 10s, I would not be shocked if one of these Exhibit 10s ends up getting that final two-way spot or even potential that final roster spot for the Miami Heat, and we see an untapped piece really break out for them as we have seen in the past. But that's who the Miami Heat have added this offseason. Let's look at who has left the Miami Heat or has not been signed that also played for the Heat last year. So this goes into the second part when losing and players, and we're going to be diving back into some of those trades. As like I mentioned, they obviously made this deal with the Pistons to bring in Simon Fontecchio, but sending out that deal, they got rid of Duncan Robinson. It was a sign-in trade in which Robinson was a free agent with the Miami Heat or had a team option, declined the option to then enter free agency and to find a new deal for him. Duncan Robinson fits in a little bit more for the Pistons as they do need some more guard shooting with losing Malik Beasley this offseason and could very valuable take that from the Heat. The Heat obviously signed Robinson after his explosive rookie year, but hadn't seen much from Robinson over these past couple years in his progression of a three-point shooter and helping out on the defensive end. Now, obviously, he did have a better year compared to some of the last ones, dating back to his rookie year being his best last season, but I do think a player in Duncan Robinson could make some impacts and ultimately had kind of passed his time on the Miami Heat. They also traded away Kevin Love, Kyle Anderson, and a first-round pick to bring in Norman Powell, and for this trade, I think this was a big one for the Heat, obviously bringing in the better player in Powell, having to give a first-round pick, giving some future draft capital, but ultimately getting rid of Kevin Love, someone who is a player on a veteran minimum and most likely going to be waived by the Utah Jazz or potentially traded to join another contender. Didn't really fit for the Heat as he was kind of playing that backup center role and wasn't really fit, maybe more a tertiary player in a rotation. And then Kyle Anderson, slow-mo, someone who was playing that small forward, power forward position. As you can see from the Heat depth chart, they clearly had a clog at that position. Anderson was part of that. They look to move off of that and invest more into their younger players in Jovic and Jaime Jaquez by moving off of a guy in Kyle Anderson. And then lastly, the last move that the Miami Heat made was taking Haywood Highsmith with his injury and trading him away to the Brooklyn Nets. This ultimately freed up a roster spot once again with Highsmith being injured and being in this logjam for the Heat. It didn't really make sense if Highsmith was healthy, when I think he'd be a solid power forward for the Heat. Yes, would he get as much run time though? I don't necessarily know, because once again, they have a very clogged forward room here in Miami, and with Highsmith getting traded, they also had to give up an additional pick as well, in which the Nets easily swooped on that to take on the contract. The Heat also lost Isaiah Stevens, one of their players who was playing in their rotation. He eventually left and went to sign with the Sacramento Kings, looking for a bigger role in their wing group. And then lastly, their unsigned free agents, they have two, Alec Burks, who's been a veteran amongst some teams with the Bucks and the Knicks these past couple seasons. He has not been signed and still is currently sitting in free agency. And then also Josh Christopher, someone who excelled with the Miami Heat G League program, was the Summer League MVP just last summer, was someone that looked to kind of grow on this Heat team after getting cut from the Houston Rockets, not really having an opportunity there. Unfortunately, has not been signed to another G League or has been signed to another regular roster, and that's someone else to keep out in the free agency pool, an eye on maybe for the Heat to pursue to bring into the G League, or for the Heat to potentially bring back if they do make a trade down the line here. But now that we've gone over everyone that's been added or lost from the Heat, let's look at their depth chart and go over my predictions. So the depth chart for the Heat does look a little wonky, and as we all know, they will have some injuries coming into the season, Tyler Hero being one of them, so he necessarily won't start off the season for the Heat. But they will most likely be running this starting lineup when fully healthy. Tyler Hero, Norman Powell, Andrew Wiggins, Bam Adebayo, and Kel'el Ware. Kel'el Ware was one of the main sticking points for the Suns to get in that Kevin Durant trade when they were a part of the rumors in the earlier part of the offseason. They were reluctant to part ways with him, and that means he's going to be getting a bigger role with the Heat. Obviously, they want to play Adebayo at that power forward position, something that he's been able to thrive on in the offensive end, and I think that this little duo is going to look very nice. Now, obviously, there are some concerns with the depth there because, like I mentioned, Precious Achiuwa is really only that other small center for this rotation. He's not even signed to a guaranteed contract. He's still on that Exhibit 9, so we'll have to keep an eye on that. But ultimately, within these rotations, they would play Bam at the center. Sometimes he's not always going to be playing power forward. So when you really do look at it, they do have two centers with Bam and Kel'el Ware, but may use some double big lineups to benefit them. We did see this Heat use Nikola Jovic as a backup center at some point, so maybe they do use a guy like Simon Fontecchio or Nikola Jovic back at that position again. But truly, I do think they would like to use them in those wing positions. Once again, Fontecchio being that kind of scoring rotational wing for the bench for this team, I really like. Keyshawn Johnson is also another young player that plays power forward that has really risen within the Heat rotation. Maybe he gets a little bit of a leap with them going a little bit younger as well. Then we also mentioned Nikola Jovic, Jaime Jaquez didn't have the greatest years last year, but could look to bounce back and find themselves some more integral roles in this Heat rotation, or could find themselves on some other teams this next year. They recently also brought back Drew Smith. They have Pelle Larsson in that shooting guard room, but also have Terry Rozier, one of the contracts that is viewed as a balloon contract, making $21 million, and one of the worst trades that the Heat have made in recent seasons. I would not be shocked if the Heat look to move off of Rozier and his $21 million expiring contract, depending on the season looks this year, to potentially get some younger players if they are towards the bottom, or to get some more steadily ready players to impact their rotation if they are looking to be a little bit better. They also have, like I mentioned, Kasparas Jakučionis, Davion Mitchell, who they brought back, who I think really invented himself in on the Miami Heat, and is someone that I'm going to be really keeping an eye on as one of the kind of glue guys for this team. Obviously, another playmaker like Jakučionis, but focuses on that defensive end, and is someone really brings that Heat feistiness and integrity on the defensive end, and someone that I think could really thrive within this rotation. Like I mentioned, the center room's a little weak. Obviously, you can move Adebayo to the center there, kind of readjust some of these wings to make it look a little bit better for the Miami Heat on the depth chart, but clearly it does look like they do have an abundance of guard with Hero, Powell, and Rozier making an abundance of money, and could look to move off of one of those guys, most likely Rozier, if they were to do a deal. Andrew Wiggins is also someone to keep an eye on with the Miami Heat. He was traded, obviously, in that Jimmy Butler deal, the one that happened right before the trade deadline had expired. There were talks of Wiggins being involved in deals with the Heat this offseason. They did not look to move off of him. He's another name where I could see maybe, if the Heat are not looking towards the top of the Eastern Conference, could be a little bit of a trade chip if he still is that impactful defender, and could lead the Heat to either getting a younger wing for their team, or potentially giving more room for Jovic and Jaquez to take over and finding another replacement in this rotation to really thrive. Ultimately, though, going into the season with these injuries with Tyler Hero, and looking at the really weird cohesiveness, of how this roster is going to be put together, I have adjusted to where I think the Heat are going to be falling in the Eastern Conference, and I think they are going to be 11th here, slowly fading away from the play-in and the playoffs, being that last team outside. Now, ultimately, they are in a toss-up with my next team that I will be detailing on the channel, so make sure you stay tuned, because I truly think that they could flip-flop with that said team. But ultimately, when looking at the cohesiveness, when looking at this roster, when looking at how they want to compete and be together, I don't necessarily see how they're going to find time for all of these guards in this rotation, and I do think they're going to have some struggles when they try to run some lineups working in this bench center here, especially if Adebayo or Kel'el Ware is injured and or tired in some of these instances. But ultimately, the Heat, I think, are a little bit in a weird zone here where they're trying to be good in a weekend Eastern Conference, but in my opinion don't have enough firepower to do so. But they could prove me wrong. They could be a sleeper. They could be a team that once Hero gets back and maybe Wiggins does click within this team, and Jovic and Jaquez have a bounce back season where Davion Mitchell looks good and Jakučionis looks good, they could be a sleeper. They could be a 7th, 8th seed in the Eastern Conference, and I would not be shocked with how close some of these teams are. And even with the injuries to the Pacers and the Celtics, I still think overall they look better as a team than the Miami Heat. And that's where I have them falling 11th here in the Eastern Conference. But I'd love to know your thoughts down below in the comments section. So let me know what you guys think about the Miami Heat, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Have a great rest of your day, and peace out.